Well, thank you for having me here today, and I get a kick out of hearing Skip telling me that I know something about politics and campaigns after somebody who's been through this for years and years. So I'm wanting to first thank you for coming out on an afternoon to hear more about politics. I know it's a big day for you all tomorrow, so you have some fun things and responsibilities to take care of tomorrow. What I want to talk about today is one of the aspects of campaigning that is both something that we really, really like and rely on and something that we get angry about, and that is polling. And I have to admit that one of my hats in life is to be a pollster. I've been accused of being a Republican stooge and a Democratic front for election after election. But I think what we try to do is understand what the electorate looks like. And so I want to talk about some things about polling, but the lesson I want to give you in advance and then for you to think about as we go through is that polls aren't there to necessarily tell you what's going to happen. Polls are there to hopefully understand what the electorate looks like and why the electorate is doing what it's doing. So I would think of the polls, especially in primaries, less as predictive and more of illustrative of what's happening in the election. So first thing, I'm going to start this with one of the worst days of my life. January 8th, 2008, I should say January 9th was the worst day when I got the phone calls at 3:30 in the morning from CNN wanting me to come and explain why our polls were so wrong. Here's a couple quotes that came from pollsters after this. Kathy Frankovich, who's the head of polling at CBS News, says, "The New Hampshire polls, what went wrong?" And she has this big, long story about the problems with polling. Similarly, Gary Langer at ABC News, and I still haven't forgiven him for this because he's a UNH alum, says, "New Hampshire's polling fiasco is simply unprecedented for so many polls to be so wrong." And here's what he's talking about. This is the last polls going through the last weeks or so. This is Hillary Clinton winning throughout the campaign, and then Barack Obama zooming to the top after he wins Iowa on the 5th of January. And all of the polls showed that Obama was going to win by an average of 7 percentage points. As it turned out, Clinton wins by 2.5. And the answer, and the fury came out. What is wrong with you people? So this is a great cartoon. This was in the Manchester Union Leader. So amateur, and that's us, the political pollsters, slumping off to the side. And this really kind of bothered me. I went back and tried to figure out what happened. And there was a big investigation by an organization called APOR, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and they went into all of these different theories about why the polls could have been so wrong and really couldn't come up with something. And first off, some of the things they said, it wasn't really a sampling issue. It wasn't that we were talking to the wrong people. It wasn't the Bradley effect, referring to the idea that voters would say that they would vote for a black candidate during a poll but not vote for them in the general election. It was most likely a late shift in the electorate. And this is why we saw it and why we didn't see it on the Republican side. So if you see the Republican side over here, there are big differences between the candidates. McCain was very well liked and the other one's not so much. But if you look at the Democratic side, there's not much difference here between any of these candidates. They're all pretty well liked, evenly liked. And if you remember those last weekends of the campaign, there was a debate on Saturday night. Hillary Clinton was asked why people didn't like her, why she was unlikable, and she said it hurts her feelings, and Barack Obama said, "Well, you're likable enough, Hillary." She had some tears in a coffee shop and said it was very hard to campaign, and that was run over and over again. And it's most likely what happened was, over the last weekend of the campaign, people changed their minds. And we saw that this one group that definitely changed their minds between the pre-election polls and the exit polls were women. And they went strongly from Obama to Clinton. And the big reason for this is when we do polling in primaries, and this is a big takeaway from today, is we're asking people what they're going to do when they don't know what they're going to do. So the bars over here, the red bars, are from exit polls showing the percentage of the voters who voted. So these are people out on election day who said they made up their mind in the last 3 days of the campaign. So if you look at the Republicans in 2012 and 2016, that's close to 50% of the voters making up their minds in the last 3 days. And on the Democratic side, it was less so. It was only 25%. But even on the last day, 23% this year, 21% in 2012, Republicans making up their mind on Election Day. So we finish up our polling on the Sunday before the election, and we got roughly half the voters haven't made up their mind yet. So when we ask them who they're going to vote for, they might tell us today on Saturday or Sunday who they're going to vote for, but that doesn't mean that they're going to hold to that on Election Day. Because for most part, on the Republican side, whoever the nominee is going to be, the Republicans are going to vote for them. Whoever the Democrat nominee is going to be, they're going to vote for that candidate as well. It's not a big deal for most people. And we get locked into the general election mindset that in a general election, we know the Democrats are going to vote for the Democratic candidate, the Republicans are going to vote for the Republican candidate, and we're just tinkering with a few people in the middle. Primaries are very, very, very different. So the primary tomorrow is likely to be different as well. I went back in previous years just to look at this in greater extent. This is just in New Hampshire, but polling is actually more often wrong than right in the New Hampshire primary. You don't have to go through all of those, but it's basically, we've had a lot worse examples. If you remember back in 1984, this was the worst one. Mondale was up by 15 to 16 points in the polls 3 days before the election. He lost by 10. People forget the past, and we are doomed to repeat it, unfortunately, in this. And it goes back to this. George Gallup had a quote, "Only a fool would poll in a primary," and he's probably right. And actually, I'll beat up on Gary Langer again from ABC News. Gary told me after the 2000 election that ABC wasn't going to poll in the primaries anymore because they were too erratic and he didn't want to look bad. And he's right. So we have low interest in the campaigns, lack of attachment to candidates, typically low turnout, and people make up their minds at the end. So polling in a primary, you shouldn't look at this as likely to be what happens. But we like to blame the messenger. I like this one. Who are you? I'm the scapegoat. Oops, I was aiming for the messenger. Oh, well, it's his own fault for being here. That's what we feel like sometimes as pollsters. We're the ones who get used as the intermediaries. We try to tell the press and the public what's going on in an election. And the one caveat I continually put out in primaries is to say that voters haven't made up their mind. They haven't made up their mind. It's not a big deal to them. And we who are in politics and cover politics, and this is, you can't understand why people don't make up their mind. And I have to turn this question around to reporters all the time and say, why should voters make up their mind early when they say, what's wrong with you people? You know, the election's next week, you haven't made up your mind yet. So why should they? It's a primary. So that's the thing I want to talk about. We do have this love-hate relationship with polls. We love to read polls. We love to watch them when they're on television. But we like to blame the pollsters when the polls don't work. Although some people like to blame the voters for doing the wrong thing and not following the polls. So polls are a good gauge of political capital. You can see who's more popular, who's known, who's unknown. They tell us what issues are important to voters across the country. They tell us what's happening in the election so you can get a sense of the flow and dynamics of the campaign. They are better than other ways of getting information on voters. In fact, this may be coming back. It certainly happens in Great Britain. In Britain, the best predictor of what's going to happen in elections is to watch the odds in the bookies for the betting parlors. Now, you can't bet on elections in the U.S., but if in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you certainly could. And though the betting odds on campaigns were pretty good predictors of who was going to win. So polls have been around. We think of them as a modern thing, but they've been around for a long time. The first ones that we could track were back to 1828. The Harrisburg, Pennsylvanian did straw polls on that election and showed that Andy Jackson was indeed going to beat John Quincy Adams that year. The Chicago Record had been running polls since 1896. They had a big poll there in the McKinley and Bryan collection. By 1828, there were 84 polls being conducted in various states around the country and 6 national polls. So this is not new. This is not new. It's been around for a long time. And why did they develop them? The big answer is to sell magazines and sell advertising. The Literary Digest, which had by the 1930s the biggest straw poll, had their biggest subscription for a 4-year period was their pre-election edition, which showed the results to the Literary Digest poll. So these were here to sell ads. They were here to get eyeballs, but they were not really what we would think of as scientific polls today. So the straw polls were notoriously unreliable. You can see that the average in 1924, they were off by 12 percentage points, which is huge by today's standards. The Literary Digest was off in 24 and 28, but 1936 was really the end of what we think of as traditional straw polls. And these were we call them straw polls because they were essentially mail-in polls, similar to kind of the magazine polls, the little tear-out things, where they would send out ballots to people around the country. And it wasn't, they sent up ballots to people around the country and they'd get them back and evaluate them. Well, the Literary Digest in 1936 sent out over 8 million ballots and got more than 2 million of them back. So this is, you think of sample sizes of 500 or 1,000 that we're using today. Sample size of 2 million ought to be pretty accurate, right? Well, they had a little problem with sampling. They used as their sampling frames lists of lists of people that owned automobiles and people's telephone numbers. So in 1936, in the depths of Depression, guess who owned cars and had telephones? Not so much poor people. So they went out and got themselves a sample of Republicans, and guess what? They told them the Republican was going to win. So they had Alf Landon defeating FDR 57-43. Well, the downside for this is the next year Literary Digest went bankrupt. So in 1936, at the same time as the Literary Digest was going bankrupt, a couple other guys you might have heard of, George Gallup in particular, developed what they called scientific sampling methods. But again, this was advertising. Gallup guaranteed that his poll would be more accurate than the Literary Digest poll, or you got your money back. And it was. But not so good. These are the three, this is like our godfathers of polling. Archibald Crossley, Elmo Roper, and George Gallup, all celebrating their defeat of the Literary Digest. So we hate polls when we have things like the 1936 election. Gallup liked it, but certainly the Literary Digest didn't like it. So the polls were far off. So Gallup did a good job in 40 and 44, but he always overestimated the Republican vote. Didn't know why. And then we get 1948, the famous Dewey defeats Truman. Polls here were all wrong. Both Roper and Gallup predicted that Dewey would win. And here they figured out the biggest issue was that they got finished polling about a month before the election, because back then they were doing these as in-person surveys where they'd have to knock on doors, and kind of computers we have today didn't exist then, so it took a lot longer to do it. So methodology becomes problematic. We got over that problem as well. So by the 1960s and 70s, all of the major TV networks have surveys. And today, this is just a recent review. These are all of the organizations that are doing political polling right now in the United States. And there are more than this that are on this list. This doesn't really include the university polls as much. The reason we have so many polls is us. We're the problem. We like them. Gallup also sold the American Institute of Public Opinion, what we call the Gallup poll, during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. He guaranteed newspapers that their subscriptions would go up when they published one of his polls. It's a marketing device. So we still see it today. We like polls. We're drawn to them. We read them in the newspaper. We watch them on television. And for the media organizations, it's a great filler for a 24/7 news broadcast. You can have a pollster tell you about the results of their new poll on the 6 o'clock news, and then on 6:30 they bring in a panel to talk about the new poll, and at 7 o'clock they bring in a new panel to talk about what the old panel said about the new poll, and then get 3 or 4 days of media coverage out of this. They can fill time. So the media's use of polls is really the problem that I see. Because they're not interested in really understanding so much. They focus on the horse race, in part because that's what we like. We want to see who's winning or losing. How'd you like to be able to go? How'd you like to have to go to a basketball game if you didn't know what the score was? Yeah, for the real hardcore basketball fanatics, it might be fun to watch for a while, but you'd really like to know who's going to win. They focus on small shifts, most of the time shifts that are not statistically significant at all, but so-and-so goes up 2 points in the polls. Must be a big news. They don't talk about differences in methodology between surveys. In fact, they have very little understanding of methodological differences, and they don't really recognize the difference in this case between general elections and primary elections, as I was alluding to earlier. But one thing they did do this year, which I think was the most unfortunate use of polling, was to pick who gets in debates and who doesn't get in debates. And the Republicans were more guilty of this, having the adult table and the kiddie table there for the debates. But Democrats did it as well. They excluded candidates from debates because they didn't show up well enough on polls. And it was really egregious this year because, especially on the Republican side, they were using national polls, in which there's no campaign going on nationally, determining who's going to get into a debate in July, in August, excuse me, the first August debate, when nobody is even thinking about the election that's going to happen more than a year from now. So they excluded some really well-known, deserving candidates from the debate based on noise, essentially. And that was, I think, really an unfortunate thing. This is a model that one of my old professors put together. And he talks about several things that I think are really important for the general public to understand. First off, as I mentioned, there's generally a lack of knowledge of politics or public affairs. We really don't care about politics most of the time. We don't know what the major issues are. We don't know what is the correct policy outcome for any particular issue. We tend to go with what our party supports must be what is good and what the other party supports is terrible, and that's about the extent of our knowledge. We ask questions that are really vague, like generally speaking, do you approve or disapprove of the job Barack Obama is doing as president? What the heck does that mean? Do I approve of his foreign policy, economic policy, healthcare policy, immigration? What is it I'm asking about? It's a vague question. We know that wording of the questions, changing the order of the questions, changing the response order can make huge differences in the response distributions for surveys. And all of this put together creates what he calls an illusion of public opinion. And he says that public opinion polls or media polls are in the job of manufacturing mass opinion, which is a really unfortunate thing, but I think that's an accurate assessment of what's going on often. We often think that, though, that polls really must be manipulating other people, just not us. So this was a survey that was done after the 2000 election. It asked whether or not polls impacted your vote, or did they impact the votes of most voters? And of course, most of us say, I don't pay any attention to polls, but everybody else must. 92% think that polls are influencing how other people vote. And it's not so much if it does or not, it's the perception that polls are doing this that's the problem. So, what can be done? Consumers, and that's us, have an obligation. We really have to understand polls. We have to spend a little bit of time looking at the methodology that is used by surveys. If you want to look at good places to do that, APOR, the American Association of Public Opinion, on their website has a nice list of best practices that should be done for election polling. ABC News does a really good job. I'll give Gary his props now. He won't let any polls be talked about on any ABC News broadcasts unless he vets the methodology of those to make sure that they meet the proper standards. But you can look at all these things yourself right now. Things that I would stay away from, robopolls. How many of you got a robopoll? You know, the computer asks you who you're going to vote for. The response rates on robopolls are about 0.5%. They're terrible. And what kind of person would talk to a computerized voice and to express their opinion? Either somebody that's really bored or somebody really wants to let people know what's up. And really remember why the media are using polls. It's to sell advertising. It's not to inform you. And I think if we pulled ourselves back from this, pulled ourselves back from the idea that we want to see who's going to win and who's going to lose, when does it really matter? So polls came out today about the Super Tuesday states. Do we really have to know today when we can really know the results tomorrow? It's one day. It's not that big of a deal. So that's an unfortunate thing. So once again, to stress the problem, we have met the enemy, and he is us. We can make polls less of a problem in elections in America, and especially when, I haven't even talked about it today, when we get into policy polling, that's even worse. But election polling is something that I think that if we just spend a little bit more time ourselves in understanding what's going on, we can reduce some of the problems. So Skip asked me to talk a little bit about Super Tuesday, which I must admit, I can tell you all day about the New Hampshire primary and what happens there. But after New Hampshire, and particularly after South Carolina, it is a completely different world when it comes to primary campaigns. So we've had candidates in New Hampshire for more than a year and a half. They were here in 2014. We had candidates visiting the state. Campaigns were set up in early 2015. We had television ads going on since the summer of 2015. We have real campaigns up there. We get really high turnout. We get 50% plus turnout in our primaries, but it's still kind of a circus. It's not really, it's a very different sort of environment. Most of the states after New Hampshire, there's essentially no campaigning going on. So what you guys got was a few candidate visits. They drop in, give some speeches, a couple stories in the newspapers covering them, maybe some television commercials that I saw on television here. We've had them for the last 3 months, from morning to night. Every commercial break is a candidate commercial. So you haven't even had that. But your opinions and your understanding of the candidates is different now than it was before New Hampshire and Iowa. You know who's won and you know who's lost. And so things are much more stable once you get past the early states. So if you think of what the job is of New Hampshire and Iowa, it's often said that we winnow the field of candidates. Really what we do is we just weed out the candidates who can't win, and then the rest of the people are largely frozen into place after New Hampshire. So it's much more stable, which actually means that polling is less problematic. So tomorrow we've got, as Skip said, states all over the country, and largely in the Southeast, but a lot of non-Southeastern states. And who does well in these states is going to matter. The problem is, for tomorrow, for the candidates, this is a big day. On the Republican side, it's about half of the delegates needed to win the nomination. So imagine Donald Trump wins all of the delegates tomorrow. He will have half of the delegates he needs to win the Republican nomination. Puts him halfway there. Not going to happen because most of these they're all proportional states. The Democrats, it's a third of the delegates needed to win the nomination as well. So this is a big, big day tomorrow. So this will, when we wake up on Wednesday morning, we'll have a really good idea of who the two nominees are most likely to be. But the problem that we have is that we don't have much good polling. There's fewer candidates, so that's nice. It's easier for people to decide. Momentum has largely been established. Clinton certainly has more momentum than Sanders does right now after South Carolina. Trump still has momentum after his wins. But there aren't really many polls. So I went this morning and looked at this. This is from Real Clear Politics. This is on the Republican side. These are the polls that are conducted in these states. So Oklahoma has had a poll by the Oklahoman and the Sooner poll. If you look at the dates on these things, they're more than a week old. Same is true down here in Alabama. We've got Opinion Savvy, who I don't know who that is, and Master Image, which is a Republican organization. So we don't know who they're supporting. Tennessee's got one from the NBC News, but the dates on that are the 23rd of February. And these are in November. These are the polls that the pundits are basing their opinions on what's going to happen on tomorrow. And then down in Arkansas, you've got Talk Business in Hendricks College poll, but that was at the beginning, a one-day robo poll at the beginning of February is the most recent poll in Arkansas. But the pundits are going to tell you what's going to happen in Arkansas tomorrow based on that. And the same is true on the Democratic side. So, and even in some other ones, the last poll in Minnesota was at the end of January. This poll in Oklahoma was 2 weeks ago, but it's a robo poll. Robo poll in Arkansas, one poll only in Colorado, and it was in November. So when pundits are up there telling you what's going to happen tomorrow, they're using the same data that is available to you. They don't know. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We can make some educated guesses and talk to the campaigns and the candidates about what's going on the ground, but we really don't know. So despite that, I'll go and tell you what I expect to happen tomorrow. Because that's what pundits are paid to do. You know, there's an old joke, what's the difference between a pundit and a pollster? Pundits don't have a track record. Pollsters have, we put numbers out. So I expect that Hillary Clinton will roll through the South. I expect her to win Texas, Arkansas, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. And if she wins those states, she'll be a long way to being the nominee. Sanders will win Vermont. He could probably win Massachusetts. Minnesota and Oklahoma are interesting. He could possibly win those states from what they're saying on the ground. This would allow him to stay in longer because these are all proportional, remember, all proportional states. So he just has to stick around to get into some states that are more favorable to him. On the Republican side, I think Trump really wins most of the states. Cruz probably in Texas. But I think the fight here is really for second place, and again, for people to survive. We were talking last night, Skip and I were, and I think that maybe the only strategy that's available for the non-Trump people in the Republican Party is to essentially have Rubio and Cruz back Kasich in the Ohio primary, Kasich and Cruz back Rubio in Florida, and Rubio and Kasich back Cruz in Texas, and hoping that they split the vote up enough so that nobody has a majority when they go into the convention. But it's down to that sort of level, which are candidates ever going to do that sort of stuff? No. But that's the way that I see that's going to play out on the Republican side. But anyway, it's going to be a lot of fun. I hope you've enjoyed the primary here. I was fascinated to see that you've got local elections going on, which adds a completely different wrinkle to how you guys do your primaries here than we have. We just have the presidential election. So you've got meaningful elections too, rather than just primaries. So I hope you enjoyed that. But I want to take time to ask any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thanks for the predictions. I appreciate it. Okay,
I'm going to destroy this very quickly.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine.
So we often hear that candidates do their own polling, the internal polls. How different are those? Are they more or less accurate? Is it methodology? Is it sampling pool?
The question is, how the candidate polls, there was people in the back that couldn't hear. What's the methodology on the candidates in their own polling?
The biggest difference between media polling and candidate polling is the candidates are trying to figure out what messages work and what doesn't work. Whereas in the media, we're more interested in, frankly, who's going to win and who's not going to win and maybe what issues are important. They're testing specific language. Yeah, they're interested in who's going to win or not, but they actually come to us and ask us, what are you seeing? Because their polls are designed in such a way that it's very difficult for them to have an accurate assessment of what's likely to happen because they purposely put in leading information and inflammatory information about their opponents, sometimes about themselves, to try to push voters to see how they're going to act or what they're going to respond to. So how many of you have gotten like what they call a push polls? Anybody gotten one of those, what you think of as a push poll, where you hear them read something to the sense of, if you knew that candidate Smith had been arrested for drunk driving 3 times, would that make you more likely or less likely to vote for him? If you knew that he had voted to scrap Social Security, would that make you more likely or less likely to vote for them? These polls are not designed to get you to change your mind, any one individual person on the phone. What they're trying to do is figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are as a candidate so they can build that into the advertising that's done later. But we often think that they're targeting us for this. Believe me, that would be way, way, way too expensive as a way to run a campaign.
Question, Craig, right back here.
What is your experience with or opinion of panel polling, continuity panel polling?
The differences between a panel poll and the kind we do what we call cross-sectional polls, where we do a random sample at a given point in time. They're nice enough of understanding what's going on right now, but it can't tell you what's happening with individual people, because we're interviewing almost exclusively completely different people each time. In a panel, what you're doing is selecting the same people and interviewing those same people multiple times. They can be helpful in understanding individual differences, but there are some problems. We call them panel effects. Panel conditioning, by asking you the same questions multiple times, you're in a different environment. You're heightened in the way you respond to questions. So there's been some research that looks at just like party identification, and they find that if you ask people their party identification over time, there's almost an expectation that among the respondent that it's supposed to change. So you see it far less stable than you would in an actual cross-sectional poll of the survey. Then the biggest panel effect is panel mortality, when people simply die and their panel is different over time, or leave the panel, I should say. But they're useful for different things, but I think for media polling, the cross-sectional ones are probably the better way of going about it. And certainly in a primary, I think it is, because people change their minds so much, you really wouldn't get much except noise of people, of voters going up and down.
Question right here.
Okay, so polls lead to information about people voting, but superdelegates, I mean, why do we need them? How did they get started? And why would a Democrat need to vote anyway if they're going to control an election?
That's very good questions. First, I should say that Republicans have superdelegates too, and maybe a better way of thinking of them is ex officio delegates. So the Republicans only have 3 per state, though, your state party chairman and the Republican National Committee man and Republican National Committee woman. But there's only 3 per state, so it doesn't make much difference. The Democrats created superdelegates, so they call them PLEOs, party leaders and elected officials, to serve as a counterweight to the real voters. This goes back to, actually it goes back to the 1968 elections. If you think of 1968 and the convention in Chicago, it's the wake of the anti-war riots, anti-war sentiment in the Democratic Party. Hubert Humphrey gets the Democratic nomination. He gets 80% of the vote on the first ballot, and he didn't even run in a single primary. He didn't even declare his candidacy until it was too late to say that you were going to run in a primary. So Democrats, anti-war Democrats, thought this is rigged. This is the smoke-filled rooms that decided who the nominee was going to be. So they created the McGovern-Fraser Commission, named after the first 2 chairmen, George McGovern, who surprisingly enough won the nomination in 1972. It always helps to write the rules if you were going to play in a game. So the McGovern-Fraser Commission created the system we have now on the Democratic side, which states are either required to hold a primary or an open caucus. Open where everybody could get in. The problem with that is the first few candidates that won under that system were George McGovern, who lost in the biggest landslide in the 20th century. Then Jimmy Carter, who was certainly not a party insider or favorite. And then there was a battle between Carter and Teddy Kennedy in 1980, which divided the party very heavily as well. And they said, you know what, this democracy stuff, maybe we got a little bit too much of that. Let's pull back a bit. And that's when they instituted the superdelegate idea. And it's about 18% of the delegates now are superdelegates or PLEOs. And it is designed to rig the system against voters. Very clear. But remember, these are party nomination contests. This is the political party deciding who their nominee should be. Arguably, the most important thing that a political party does is choose their nominee. Why should we leave those big decisions to mere voters, is the way parties look at it often. And now we're seeing the Republican Party saying, boy, I wish we had some superdelegates right now. We could probably do some different things. But that's the reason they have them. And yes, superdelegates, though, superdelegates can make a difference in who wins, but historically what's happened is they've gone the same way as their states have gone, or the nomination is over. I think this year, depending on what happens tomorrow, we'll likely see that Clinton is the considerable front runner in the battle, and superdelegates really won't make much of a difference one way or the other.
Okay. Got a question right here. Microphone's coming at you.
I understand that there's polls have gotten much harder since people stopped having landlines and now have cell phones. I wondered if you could tell us something about why that is, and then
Sure.
also, is a solution to that a sort of a new generation way to do it, email or internet polling in enough volume?
Sure. Response rates have been declining in surveys since the 1980s, really. National polls like the Gallup poll and Pew Research Center polls get response rates about 7%, 8%, meaning that 93 to 94% of all of the households that they talk to, they don't get a completed interview from. Now, most of the research shows there's not much difference there. And I would say that both Gallup and Pew now use cell phones. Gallup didn't in 2012. They didn't call cell phones. The problems with cell phones is that they're much more expensive to do surveys with cell phones. So we do them in our surveys. About 65% of our interviews are completed by cell phone, about 35% by landline. But it takes us about twice as many phone calls to a cell phone to get a completed interview as it does with a landline. How many of you look at your cell phones and you look at the number and you don't know who it is and you don't bother? Even with caller ID and call waiting at home, that phone rings and we're trained to answer the phone, and we still do it more often. Also, the people that have cell phones or are in cell phone only households are more likely to be younger, have lower levels of education, lower levels of income, and not lived in their house as long. Those things are also correlated with people who don't vote and don't vote as often. So it's harder to get those people engaged in politics or discussions, and they're not interested in expressing their opinions on these things. So it has become a problem, but I don't believe that internet polls are the way to go yet. First of all, there's no way you can do random sampling with the internet. The entire process of political polling or public opinion polling is based on the idea that you can get a random sample of a population and that every person in the entire population has an equal chance of being selected into the sample. You don't have that with web surveys or email-based surveys. You tend to get self-selected samples. You tend to get people that have much higher levels of motivation than do regular voters who just get called at home, and they seem to express different kinds of opinions. Now, all of the organizations that are working on that have their own kind of black box formula for taking care of some of these issues and problems, and I imagine as we go forward, they'll come up with better techniques for doing this, but they'll never get around the problem of not having random samples. And that to me is, I'm just old-fashioned. I grew up with the central limit theorem. Remember in your statistics classes, for those of you who like statistics, the central limit theorem, it's a very important thing. It's a very powerful tool.
Carney got a question right here. We'll get there.
Polls supposedly tell us what's going to happen based on reasons. My question is there a single reason that Trump is doing so well?
Probably several reasons that he's doing so well. The things that we're seeing in our polls is first off, and this is not only mine but national polls on the Republicans, first off is that there is a general anger among rank and file Republican voters with their party and their party leaders. They just think that they're being used as pawns. You know, we elect you guys and you ignore us. So there is just a general level of anger. There's another level of anger that's out there among Republicans because they say, you know, we keep nominating these guys for president that are supposed to be able to win because they're moderate and everybody likes them, they look like a presidential candidate, and they keep getting clobbered. Why should we send up another person like that? So there's some of that involved. And the issue of immigration has been an issue that rank and file Republicans and Democrats have been very upset about for a long time, and nobody wants to touch it within Washington for a lot of good reasons, bad reasons, whatever. There's reasons that they do this, but that issue during down economic times, when people are thought to be coming across the border and taking jobs that we can't get now, and we see our wages stagnated for 15, 20 years. That creates a lot of anger, and if you think that your party bosses are behind that, you're really not happy with the people that have been insiders in your party. One of the things that we've been tracking is conservative talk radio. So even in a state like New Hampshire, which is one of the most moderate Republican states in the country, about 20%, 25% of Republicans say they regularly listen to conservative talk radio shows like the Rush Limbaugh Show or the Sean Hannity Show. And if you looked at who they supported in the New Hampshire primary, it was Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, way up here in favorability ratings and in who they're going to vote for. Marco Rubio and Chris Christie kind of in the middle, and way down here is Jeb Bush and John Kasich. And if you ever listen to those shows, Bush and Kasich, particularly for their positions on immigration, have been hammered for the last year. they have no chance. And those people that listen to conservative talk radio are more informed about politics than most other Republicans, and they will talk about it to their neighbors and friends. And they'll argue with their neighbors and friends about who they should support. And in a primary where most people really don't care much one way or another about who wins, those sorts of personal arguments, I think, are very persuasive.
Hello, my name is Catherine Baxter. I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton
Great.
School. Thank you for being here today. You mentioned how polls done in July, August are not very meaningful when it actually comes time to have the primary. And I was wondering what you would say about the value of these hypothetical sort of Republican-Democrat matchups. So what does a Clinton-Trump, what does a Sanders-Cruz matchup look like? How should voters consider that if electability is a factor in their vote?
I wouldn't put a lot of stock in them. I think back to the 1988 presidential election, where right after the Democratic convention, Michael Dukakis had about a 30-point lead over George H.W. Bush. It didn't turn out that way. Because we don't know enough about the candidates. Getting back to the first point, most people aren't paying attention to this race. They're not paying attention to the general election. Fully a third of the voters won't really pay attention to the general election until after Labor Day next year. A quarter or so, when in November they'll start to pay attention. So a lot of it now is fluff, it's noise. The one thing, though, that and Clinton, I think, has made a mistake with this on her campaign by saying that vote for her because she's more electable. And they say, well, what basis do you have for saying you're more electable? And people point to polls. Well, she's not more electable according to polls. Actually, Sanders does better in a lot of the national polls than Clinton does. And certainly, we just released some numbers today in New Hampshire that showed that Sanders is running about 10 percentage points better than Clinton is against Republicans in New Hampshire, which is a swing state. So you have to be careful with electability. Not that they're meaningful in any particular way, but if you introduce that into a campaign as the reason the candidate voters should vote for you, when somebody else could point to data and say, well, these data don't say that, then you have a problem. But campaigns often, I would say, campaigns like to choose data that may not be fully supportable, but sound good in a campaign. I'm trying to be polite about that. How do you work that?
Alex, you have a question right there.
Hi, my name is Alex Meldum. I'm a first year here at Clinton School of Public Service. So by what you've been saying, it seems like the media has been pretty responsible with the way they give out the information, or at least get in the information. A lot can be said about how the parties use it too. Do you think with what's been happening with these elections, with Trump getting all of this media coverage and them making it sound more like a reality TV show than elections, do you think we can expect over the coming years that rules will be set in to avoid polls being used in such an irresponsible manner?
I think there are going to be attempts and changes, I imagine, by both parties to look at this and figure out what happened. Whether there could be rules to stop polls from being used, I don't think that's the case. And the media organizations that put these out are covered by First Amendment rights. They can put out whatever they want. I hope that the parties will recognize that using polls to determine who gets on a debate stage is a bad idea. But again, the parties were involved with that. Now the parties are saying no as the media. They're the ones who use the polls to keep people in debates or off the debate stage. But it really was the parties that wanted the media to do that. They were basically letting the media do their dirty work for them. So their hands were clean. The parties don't want hard-fought nomination battles. They would love to be able to determine who the nominee is a year before and have that person coast into the nomination and into the general election. So there's been a long-standing conflict between three different groups. One are the candidates themselves that want to be president. The second is the parties who want to choose somebody who can win in November, because ultimately that's the reason parties exist, is to win elections and win majorities. And third is the desires of the voters out here. And the desires of the voters, frankly, are the least important to these other two groups. They want to control what the voters do rather than react to what the voters do. And that's the problem that we've got going forward. I think the bigger issue with Trump is people are going to look at the way he ran this campaign, which is completely unusual. He's running this as a celebrity, as a media star, as a reality television star, and with a shtick that is very persuasive to a lot of voters. That show was a top 10 show for 10 years. It obviously resonates with a lot of people who like to see some tough guy saying, "You're fired, get out of here." But Trump he's really a master of manipulating the media because he's been doing it for 10 years in television. And he talks about his ground game. He doesn't have a ground game. His organization in New Hampshire was largely non-existent. But he'll say he was even, on the night they won the New Hampshire primary, he was congratulating his campaign manager for the great ground game they put in place, which they started a week before the primary. And if any of you have been in politics, the only way you can put together a good ground game is start like 6 months beforehand. But he's running a very different campaign, and I think that's going to be the bigger issue that the parties are going to look at to see is how somebody like a Donald Trump can do that, and what does that mean in the future? What kind of people are going to run for president, and what can parties do to kind of dissuade or keep those people from running? Because I think in the long run, it's much better to have somebody with electoral experience and policy experience than not running for president.
Yes, Mike, go back over here. Well, that's okay. You go. We'll get her, then you go to the next one.
My question isn't specifically about polling, so you may choose not to answer it. But do you think there's any likelihood at all that the Republicans will have a brokered convention?
Well, I'm not that old, but I remember when, as a young political scientist, reading through our political science books and American political history, reading about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson and saying, wow, that would be cool to see an impeachment in my lifetime. I never thought I'd see it. And then I'd read about like the 1876 election, in which, I'm blanking on his name now, was it? I think it was Rutherford B. Hayes won the presidency. Against Tilden. And he didn't win a majority of the popular vote or the electoral college vote. And I was saying, I wonder if there's ever going to be a time in which we have an election in which one person wins the popular vote and another person wins the electoral college vote. What would happen there? And I never thought I'd see that happen either. I never thought I'd see a brokered convention happen either. The last one was in 1928, maybe 1976 was the closest we've come to possibly having one. The rules are set up on the Democratic side, so it favors it because it's proportional delegate allocation throughout. You're more likely to see it there, but there's only 2 candidates, so it's not likely to happen. The Republican side has proportional allocation until the 15th. After the 15th, states can choose to have winner-take-all or proportional, and some of the big states have chosen to do winner-take-all. I think the only way we're likely to see one is if Rubio wins Florida and gets all their delegates, Kasich wins Ohio and gets all their delegates, and if Cruz wins Texas and wins a lot of delegates, but these candidates have to win more delegates in other states as well. If you've got 4 candidates going into that convention, with Donald Trump, say, having 48% of the delegates, but the other one's not, you know, you could see that happening, but historically that's just not been the case. We're seeing the momentum build from the early states the way it typically does, that the candidates who win early become winners and the people who lose become losers. They either quit or they just kind of bump along and don't really do so much after that. And I guess tomorrow we'll really be able to understand whether or not that momentum is going to play out in the future here. If Cruz is able to win Texas and maybe Rubio wins a couple states and Trump gets dinged a bit, doesn't do as well, then there's potential that it could happen. But again, I didn't think those other things were happening. I don't think this is likely to happen, but maybe this year is a better chance than ever in the last 75, 100 years.
In the primary season, it seems to make sense to rely on these state polls, but when we switch to the general election, the media relies excessively on these national polls. Could you speak to the appropriateness of that? It's always struck me as very odd. It's not a national election. It's
Exactly.
a series of 50 state elections, and included in that sample are going to be states like Texas and California and New York, which simply are not competitive.
You're absolutely right. I think that after 2000, we would have realized that we don't have a presidential election. We have 51 presidential elections. And that state by states really, really matter. And I think, again, I'll use New Hampshire as an example. Our polling there was showing that that race was incredibly close, that Bush was up by like a half of a percentage point and 1 percentage point. And he ended up winning by 7,000 votes there. And Ralph Nader got 22,000 votes in New Hampshire. If Gore had been focused more on the state-by-state polling and spent maybe another weekend in New Hampshire or ran a few more ads or did something to boost his campaign, he would have likely have been the president, but didn't pay attention to it. But the national polls, the national press pay attention to national polls because what do they have to do? They've got a national audience, CNN, ABC, NBC, they have national audiences. They want to have their poll out there that's meaningful to their national audience, so they run national polls. But I would pay much, much more attention to the state-by-state polls. I obviously wouldn't pay much attention to California polls. I know what's going to happen in California. I won't pay any attention to Utah polls. I know what's going to happen there. But Ohio, Florida, Virginia, Indiana, New Hampshire, Iowa, Colorado, New Mexico, pay attention to those states. So again, it's up to us. You know, we shouldn't really blame the press for doing what they're doing if you understand why they're doing it, but we don't have to follow what it is that they're giving us. All this information is easily available now, so. But you're right, there's not a national election, it's 51.
Craig, got a question right here.
If you talk to Republicans, they're giddy. The one thing they are giddy about is the participation in the caucuses and the primaries. How accurate a predictor is that? Because the Democrats had that participation in 2008.
There is some evidence that primary participation is a factor in general election mobilization. It happens in a couple ways. First off, if you get more voters engaged and they come out in a primary, the likelihood that they will vote in a general election is considerably higher for those individuals who voted. Voting is a habit. If you engage somebody early, they're more likely to show up later on. So that is one aspect of it. There's a political scientist named Helmut Norpoth that has put together a model looking at predicting presidential elections, and some of the things that he puts into the model, or one of the factors that he puts into his model, is participation rates in early primaries. And if one party has higher participation rates, it does have a positive impact on their likelihood that they get elected in the general election in November. The flip side of that is if you have one party having significantly lower rates, it usually is indications of one of two things. First off, that there's no race going on at all, or that they're not really happy with the candidates that they've got. And if you have less interest and less concern about the candidates that you have in a primary election, you're going to have an even harder time pulling people out in a general election when you have to rely on an electorate that is less engaged and less informed about politics. So if you can't get the engaged people out in a primary, you're really going to have a hard time getting the even less engaged people out in a general election. So there is some evidence that backs that up. I think the difference is that between now and November, a whole lot of things can happen to throw this off. Was it Harold Macmillan was asked, you know, what's the most important thing, rough paraphrasing, what's the most important thing in politics or determine who wins election? He says the events. Events are what matters, and you try to control for all the things that you can control, but there's a big world out there, and things are going to happen that these candidates have to respond to that make the difference. So give that example. Back in 2008, both nationally and say in New Hampshire, John McCain was leading in polls in middle of September until the financial crisis hit, boom, and then it was all over for McCain and Republicans. But they didn't have any control over that.
Well, I know there are more questions, but we're running out of time, and I hope that you will come visit with Andy as he signs this new book, The First Primary, about New Hampshire. I think I've read this book. It should be required reading in any elections and political science classes because it really does talk about how important the role of New Hampshire and the primary system in American politics. Be sure, if you haven't early voted, to vote tomorrow. It's going to be one whale of a day in America. Thank you all very much for being here.